Have you ever wondered why some financial disasters seem to repeat with almost mathematical precision? As if every nation is destined to fall into the same trap no matter how advanced it becomes? That question is the key to understanding why the South Sea Bubble in the 1700s, the German monetary collapse in the 1920s, the Mexican crisis of the 1990s, and now Brazil in 2025, all follow the exact same fraudulent pattern. At first glance, these events look unrelated, separated by centuries, cultures, and political systems. But when you peel back the layers, the same blueprint emerges. It always starts with confidence, with leaders promising prosperity, stability, and control. It always escalates into manipulation of money, markets, and public expectations. And it always ends when the illusion breaks and people realize the system was quietly rotting long before the collapse became visible. The most dangerous part of this pattern is its invisibility during the early stages. Nations rarely notice when they cross from healthy growth into financial distortion. The South Sea Company convinced Britain that limitless profits were guaranteed. Germany believed printing money would save the economy rather than destroy it. Mexico trusted that foreign capital would never flee. And today, Brazil is being told that rising numbers mean progress, even as the foundations weaken under the surface. You can almost feel the tension building, that silent moment before the break, when everything still looks normal, but nothing is stable anymore. What truly binds these stories together is not the crises themselves, but the psychology behind them. Every society believes it is too smart, too modern, too prepared to be fooled by the same tricks that deceived previous generations. But history has no mercy for arrogance. When governments manipulate currency, hide structural flaws, and rely on debt to mask decline, they set in motion the same unstoppable sequence that has toppled nations again and again. And what Brazil is experiencing right now fits perfectly into this long chain of repeating frauds, pushing it closer to the critical point where the pattern becomes undeniable. You might even see traces of it in your own life. Prices rising faster than wages. Promises of growth that never seem to materialize. A sense that the numbers reported publicly don't reflect the reality people feel daily. These are early warnings that the cycle is maturing, that the hidden mechanisms are accelerating beneath the surface. And understanding this pattern is not just about economics, it is about seeing clearly what most people refuse to acknowledge until it is too late. If this opening made you recognize signs you may have overlooked, tell me what part resonated with you. Leave a comment sharing your experience, make sure to like this video, and check whether you are subscribed so you do not miss the next steps of this unfolding sequence as we continue into the deeper stages that reveal how this pattern tightens its grip. What becomes clear as the pattern unfolds is that the first stage is never explosive or dramatic. It begins as a subtle shift, almost imperceptible to the population, when ambition quietly replaces discipline and financial innovation morphs into a tool of distortion. Nations at this early phase still appear stable on the surface. Markets operate, institutions function, and leaders reassure the public that everything is under control. Yet beneath that polished exterior, the seeds of the crisis are already being planted. In the South Sea era, investors believed they were participating in a visionary enterprise that would unlock unimaginable wealth. In Germany, policymakers convinced themselves that expanding the money supply was a temporary necessity rather than a structural threat. And Mexico, intoxicated by foreign investment, celebrated growth without acknowledging that its financial architecture was dangerously unbalanced. This first stage often seduces even the most skeptical observers because it rewards them. Asset prices rise, credit expands, consumption increases, and optimism becomes the dominant narrative. It feels like progress, and people naturally want to believe it. Governments amplify this belief by presenting the early distortions as victories. They highlight short-term improvements while ignoring the long-term risks forming beneath. The problem is not the growth itself, but the fragility of its foundation. When prosperity depends on borrowed confidence rather than real productivity, the system begins drifting toward instability long before anyone realizes what is happening. Over time, something shifts in the national mindset. Authorities become more comfortable using shortcuts. Markets adjust to the new incentives. and society gradually accepts practices that would have been unthinkable just a decade earlier. Debt becomes normal, currency manipulation becomes strategic, and risk becomes invisible. What makes this transition so dangerous is that it doesn't feel like a transition at all. It feels like natural evolution, like a country adapting to modern pressures. But this is precisely how Stage 1 disguises itself, by presenting deterioration as progress. This same disguised transformation can be seen today in Brazil. Rising credit, expanding fiscal promises, and artificial boosts to consumption create the illusion of momentum. Meanwhile, underlying vulnerabilities deepen. Structural productivity issues remain unresolved, financial dependence grows, and the belief that the system can stretch indefinitely becomes a national narrative. And once a country accepts this illusion as truth, it quietly steps into the second stage, where the consequences begin to intensify and the pattern becomes much harder to escape, even though it still appears manageable to those who haven't yet connected the dots. As the cycle advances, the system shifts from a fragile equilibrium into something more dangerous, entering the phase where the distortions introduced earlier start feeding on themselves. This is the moment when governments, instead of correcting their trajectory, double down on the very mechanisms that created the instability. In every historical case, this transition seemed rational at the time. The South Sea directors believed issuing more speculative shares would stabilize the scheme. German policymakers insisted that expanding the money supply was necessary to maintain social order. Mexican officials trusted that attracting even more foreign capital would compensate for structural weaknesses. Each decision felt like a temporary fix, yet each one pushed the system closer to irreversible damage. This third stage is defined by a critical illusion: the belief that short-term management can delay long-term consequences. Leaders convince themselves that they can outsmart the downturn, and markets, conditioned by earlier periods of artificial prosperity, respond positively. Investors interpret these interventions as signs of strength rather than desperation. Meanwhile, hidden imbalances accumulate at a speed that even insiders fail to recognize. What appears to be a controlled adjustment is, in reality, the beginning of acceleration toward the breaking point. This stage also marks the moment when the public narrative begins to diverge from reality. Statistics are framed to emphasize progress while omitting context. Financial reports highlight partial successes and obscure systemic weaknesses. Optimism is no longer organic. It becomes curated. And because people naturally prefer reassurance over uncertainty, this manufactured confidence spreads easily. The population internalizes the belief that the government, the markets, or the institutions will somehow correct the course before things get out of hand. But history shows that once a nation reaches this psychological threshold, it rarely turns back. The structure becomes too dependent on the very distortions that are tearing it apart. Brazil fits this pattern with unsettling precision. Policies designed to stimulate growth increasingly rely on mechanisms that postpone rather than resolve structural issues. Credit expansion replaces productivity. Fiscal promises replace long-term planning. The growing dependency on financial engineering masks underlying fragilities, giving the impression that the country is adapting successfully to pressures that, in truth, are escalating. And as confidence becomes more artificial, the system edges closer to the threshold where the next stage takes shape, the moment when the accumulated distortions begin interacting, amplifying one another in ways that no policy, no reform, and no reassurance campaign can fully contain. As the system moves into the fourth stage, the quiet distortions of the earlier phases begin to collide with one another, creating pressures that can no longer be contained by narrative or policy. This is the point where the government's interventions stop masking weaknesses and start accelerating them. Historically, this is where every major fraud-based collapse becomes visible, not because the truth suddenly emerges, but because the machinery holding the illusion together begins to strain under its own contradictions. In the South Sea era, speculative confidence mutated into outright frenzy, pushing valuations beyond anything supported by reality. In Germany, monetary expansion that once felt like relief spiraled into a currency structure that no longer obeyed basic economic logic. In Mexico, Capital inflows, once celebrated as a symbol of progress, became a trap when investors realized the foundation was unsustainable, triggering a reversal that no authority could stop. Stage 4 is the moment when governments typically attempt their boldest maneuvers. They implement aggressive interventions, announce reassuring programs, and speak with greater certainty than ever before. But this confidence isn't a sign of control, it's a signal of urgency. Every new measure is designed to delay a correction that would otherwise expose years of structural mismanagement. Instead of confronting root problems, policymakers concentrate on maintaining appearances. They expand credit, modify regulations, create temporary boosts, and use whatever tools remain to prolong stability. These actions may calm the public temporarily, but they also deepen the structural fractures they were meant to fix. At this stage, society begins to sense that something is wrong even if it cannot yet articulate it. Prices behave unpredictably. Promises of stability feel increasingly disconnected from lived experience. Economic indicators fluctuate in ways that don't align with official explanations. A subtle shift occurs in public mood, as uncertainty transforms into quiet tension. What makes Stage 4 uniquely destabilizing is that both insiders and ordinary citizens start feeling the tremors, yet the system still insists everything is fine. The facade remains intact, but cracks spread underneath it. In Brazil, these dynamics have become increasingly visible. Complex financial solutions are introduced to hold the system together, but none address the deeper imbalances that have been accumulating for years. Attempts to stabilize key sectors often result in new vulnerabilities, linking one fragile area to another until the entire structure becomes interdependent and brittle. The country finds itself navigating an environment where each short-term fix amplifies the long-term risks, pushing the nation into the same momentum that has historically led others into the fifth stage of the pattern. If you've noticed signs like these around you, or felt that something about the current financial landscape doesn't add up, share what caught your attention in the comments so we can explore these signals together. Reaching the fifth stage means crossing a line that very few nations ever recover from, because this is the moment when the underlying fraud is no longer an accessory to the system. It becomes the system itself. What began as occasional manipulation, subtle distortions, or temporary measures now evolves into a structural feature of national finance. In every historical collapse, Stage 5 marks the point where leaders no longer attempt to disguise the mechanisms they once hid. Instead, they normalize them. They justify what would previously have been unthinkable, and gradually condition the population to accept practices that reveal how deeply the country is trapped. This is the phase where incentives fully invert. The government becomes dependent on the very practices that weaken it. Rather than correcting imbalances, it relies on them for survival. In the South Sea collapse, the company's speculative structure became the foundation of Britain's financial optimism. And once belief became essential, truth became irrelevant. In Germany, the state depended on money creation just to meet its most basic obligations, transforming an emergency tool into a routine operation. Mexico, facing structural fragility, clung to volatile foreign capital even though it knew the inflows were unstable and could reverse at the slightest shock. Stage 5 is not defined by chaos, but by entrapment. Every solution increases vulnerability. Every attempt at stability deepens the fracture. This is also the moment when the population begins living two different realities at once. On paper, the nation may still report indicators that suggest progress, or at least control. Official statements continue to emphasize resilience, strategy, and modernization. But daily life tells a different story. People begin to feel the weight of invisible pressures embedded in the economy. Prices move unpredictably, savings erode faster, and expectations slowly collapse. A collective intuition emerges. A sense that something fundamental has shifted, even if the shift hasn't yet been formally acknowledged. This tension sets the stage for what comes next, when recognition spreads from economists and analysts to ordinary households. For Brazil, the signs of Stage 5 have become more evident. The reliance on financial maneuvers has grown to the point where removing them would destabilize everything they were designed to protect. Fiscal adjustments depend on temporary patches rather than structural reform. Currency and Credit mechanisms expand not because they fuel real productivity, but because the system cannot function without them. Public discourse becomes divided between those who sense the deterioration and those who cling to official narratives out of necessity or hope. And as the distance between these two realities widens, the country steps deeper into the same pattern that has marked every major financial unraveling throughout history. When a country progresses into the sixth stage of this historical pattern, the comparison with past crises becomes unavoidable because the similarities are no longer abstract, they are structural. This is the point where the trajectory of different nations, separated by centuries and continents, begins to overlap so precisely that it feels like they are reading from the same script. The South Sea collapse revealed how fragile a financial system becomes when speculation replaces substance. Germany showed what happens when monetary distortion reaches a scale that breaks public trust. Mexico demonstrated how quickly external confidence evaporates when underlying imbalances can no longer be concealed. And now, Brazil finds itself tracing the same arc, not through coincidence, but through the same sequence of decisions, incentives, and pressures that have defined every major fraud-based financial unraveling. What unites these examples is not the surface details, but the internal dynamics that drive them. In each case, authorities insisted that their circumstances were different, their models unique, their systems resilient. Yet beneath those assurances, the same dependencies grew. Excessive leverage, distorted incentives, and a reliance on short-term fixes that eroded long-term stability. By the time each nation reached stage 6, denial was no longer a protective shield. It was the final obstacle standing between perception and reality. The system had already shifted from fragile to unstable, and the institutions meant to protect it were now struggling to preserve credibility as much as functionality. In this stage, the patterns intensify in a way that becomes unmistakable to those who study economic history. Market corrections become sharper, policy responses become more reactive, and financial stress spreads across sectors that once appeared unconnected. Signals that had been subtle in earlier stages now appear openly. Volatility increases, capital becomes more cautious, and the cracks that were once hidden behind optimistic forecasts begin to widen. Trust, the most essential and least visible component of any financial system, starts to erode. And once trust weakens, it rarely returns with the same strength. Brazil mirrors these dynamics with striking accuracy. The country stands at a point where the mechanisms used to support the system now expose its vulnerabilities. Indicators that were once interpreted as temporary disturbances begin to look like symptoms of a deeper disorder. Policies that once soothed the public now raise questions, and each move to stabilize one sector seems to destabilize another. Just as in the South Sea speculation, German monetary disintegration, and the Mexican inversion of capital flows, Brazil is experiencing the phase where the pattern tightens and the margin for error shrinks dramatically. This convergence, across time, geography, and historical context, is what makes Stage 6 so critical. It is here that the past speaks the loudest, not as a warning, but as a mirror, reflecting what is already unfolding, revealing the trajectory before the final stage becomes unavoidable. As the pattern advances into the space between stages 5 and 6, a country enters one of the most unstable and unpredictable phases of the entire sequence. This is the moment when governments begin to lose their ability to shape outcomes, even as they continue to project confidence. Policies that once offered temporary relief start producing diminishing returns. Measures intended to calm the markets begin to raise new questions instead of providing reassurance. From the outside, the system still appears functional. Institutions operate, announcements are made, official forecasts remain optimistic. But internally, control is slipping. Every decision becomes reactive. Every adjustment becomes a response to pressures that have grown beyond the reach of conventional tools. In the South Sea crisis, this was the period when the company desperately attempted to prop up its collapsing valuations, only to accelerate its downfall. Germany experienced the same dynamic as authorities tried to contain inflation with increasingly radical actions that only fueled more instability. Mexico encountered it when policymakers attempted to defend the currency against forces that had already moved far beyond their command. The same underlying truth connects all three cases. Once momentum turns against a nation at this stage, the system behaves less like an economy and more like a chain reaction. Each intervention triggers consequences that no one can fully anticipate, because the structure has become too interconnected and too fragile to absorb new shocks. This transitional phase is also marked by a visible shift in public perception. People who once trusted institutional explanations begin to question them. Early warning signs become topics of everyday conversation, not just analysis. Information spreads faster than authorities can manage, and uncertainty begins to shape behavior at every level of society. Families change their spending habits. Businesses hesitate on investments. Investors reposition quietly. Even those who don't fully understand the mechanics sense that familiar patterns are breaking down. History shows that this collective instinct often emerges long before the final collapse becomes official. For Brazil, this moment has arrived. The country now moves through an environment where institutional confidence is fragile, economic signals contradict each other, and policy measures increasingly resemble attempts to buy time, rather than solutions to underlying issues. The system still functions, but with an unmistakable strain, one that echoes the same pressures that destabilized past economies on the brink of their next and most violent stage. It is the calm before a storm that has repeated itself in every financial disaster built on hidden weaknesses and prolonged denial. If you've sensed this tension around you or noticed these subtle shifts in daily life, share your perspective in the comments so we can map these signals together. When a system finally crosses into the early contours of Stage 6, the transformation is no longer theoretical. It becomes visible in the behavior of the currency, the financial institutions, and the public itself. This is the stage where confidence, once merely strained, begins to fracture. The architecture of the economy still stands, but the pillars that support it start to weaken under pressures they can no longer absorb. This moment is subtle enough that many people fail to identify it in real time, yet powerful enough that once it takes full shape, the shift becomes irreversible. It is the phase in which years of accumulated distortions converge, forming a pressure point that exposes the true fragility of the system. In every historical case, this is when markets begin responding to signals the government can't control. During the South Sea collapse, investors who once believed in endless growth suddenly realized that the valuations were detached from reality, triggering a chain reaction that even the most forceful interventions couldn't stop. In Germany, the currency's internal logic broke apart as the money supply expanded beyond anything the economy could anchor, causing society to lose faith in the very unit used to measure value. Mexico lived through the same moment when foreign investors stopped treating the country as an opportunity and began treating it as a risk, withdrawing capital at a speed that no defensive measure could counter. Stage 6 reveals the weakness of systems that relied too heavily on narratives rather than fundamentals. Governments attempt to maintain stability by reinforcing the same messaging that once reassured the public, but the effect has changed. What was previously interpreted as confidence now sounds like repetition. What once stabilized expectations now raises suspicion. It's not that institutions stop functioning, they continue their routines. But the belief that those routines can prevent deeper deterioration begins to fade. Markets respond faster than policymakers, and the public reacts faster than institutions. This widening timing gap becomes the signature feature of the sixth stage. Brazil is entering this terrain with all the markers that defined previous crises. The currency faces recurring pressure that can no longer be attributed to temporary fluctuations. Financial signals once brushed aside as anomalies are now forming consistent patterns. Policy responses increasingly resemble attempts to manage symptoms rather than strengthen the core. And as these elements converge, the system begins shifting into a mode where trust becomes more important than any statistic, yet simultaneously more fragile than at any prior moment. What makes this stage so pivotal is not the visible instability itself, but the quiet erosion beneath it. The recognition that the mechanisms once relied upon no longer carry the same weight. From here, each development compounds the next, drawing the country closer to the full manifestation of the pattern that history has seen unfold many times before. As the cycle approaches its final stretch before the breaking point, nations caught in this historical pattern enter a phase defined by desperation, disguised as strategy. Stage 9 is not yet the collapse itself, but the final attempt to delay it. The moment when governments, institutions, and financial authorities begin taking actions that are meant to restore control, but instead accelerate the trajectory toward the inevitable. This is the stage where confidence has already been compromised, where the system no longer responds predictably, and where every decision made in the name of stability carries unforeseen consequences. The structure still stands, but it does so under strain so severe that even small pressures can trigger disproportionate reactions. This is the same moment when Germany, in its final attempts to manage the crisis, implemented measures that only deepened the monetary disintegration. Their efforts to stabilize prices, control wages, and manage currency flows were not fundamentally misguided. They were simply too late, applied in an environment where the core mechanics of trust had already collapsed. Mexico experienced a similar pattern as it tried to defend the peso with increasingly aggressive interventions, each one draining reserves, signaling weakness, and fueling even greater capital flight. The South Sea Company followed the same trajectory centuries earlier, implementing extraordinary resolutions and restructuring schemes that promised stability, yet revealed panic. The pattern is consistent. Once a nation reaches this stage, the interventions that were once tools become warnings, revealing that policymakers are no longer shaping events. They are reacting to them. What defines this stage more clearly than any technical indicator is the psychological inversion that takes place within the society. People stop interpreting announcements as information and begin interpreting them as signals of distress. Financial markets start moving ahead of policy rather than in response to it. Businesses adjust defensively, consumers reduce risk, and investors position themselves as if anticipating something that has not yet been publicly acknowledged. It is in this environment that the final adjustments are made, not because leaders think these measures will solve anything, but because doing nothing would expose the truth even faster. The goal becomes extending time, not restoring stability. Brazil's trajectory at this stage mirrors the same dynamics seen in past crises that followed the 7-stage fraud pattern. Financial authorities introduce measures that attempt to reassure both domestic and international audiences, but each intervention signals just how narrow the margin of stability has become. Markets react sharply to minor announcements, currency fluctuations carry more weight than before, and institutional messaging begins to conflict with observable reality. Structural problems that were once manageable now expand at a pace that outstrips the capacity of traditional responses. The system enters a feedback loop, where the attempt to control volatility ends up creating more of it. This stage is the final threshold before the full emergence of the collapse pattern, the point where history shows that the system no longer bends. It begins to fracture in ways that cannot be reversed, only endured. Everything that comes next is shaped by the pressures accumulated here, in the narrow space between control and the loss of it. When the pattern finally reaches its 7th stage, the transformation that has been building for years becomes undeniable. This is the moment when an economy no longer struggles under the weight of its distortions. It breaks beneath them. What was once a system marked by hidden weaknesses becomes a structure defined by open fractures. The collapse is rarely a single event. Instead, it unfolds like a chain reaction. Institutions falter, currencies lose their anchor, public confidence evaporates, and the mechanisms that once held everything together no longer function in any predictable way. The final stage is not sudden chaos, but the culmination of every ignored warning, every delayed reform, and every attempt to postpone the consequences that earlier generations set in motion. In the South Sea scandal, the collapse revealed itself through a rapid unwinding of speculative illusions. Germany faced a complete erosion of monetary value, where savings dissolved and daily life became a fight against a currency that no longer held meaning. Mexico endured a reversal so violent that decades of progress vanished within months, exposing the fragility beneath its apparent growth. These outcomes differed on the surface, yet all were byproducts of the same deeper mechanism. Once trust is broken at the systemic level, no institution, no policy, and no reassurance can fully restore it. Trust takes decades to build, but only days to lose. For Brazil, the implications of reaching this stage are profound. It is not merely about economic volatility. It is about the psychological shift that occurs when a population no longer believes the assurances of its own institutions. When people begin relying on alternative stores of value, when businesses prepare for instability instead of growth, when policymakers fight to maintain order rather than shape the future, the character of the economy changes. It becomes reactive, fragile, and exposed to shocks that previously would have been absorbed. The system may still function, but it does so with a different logic, one shaped by urgency rather than strategy. Yet even in this final stage, history offers something valuable: clarity. The events that unfold now reveal the full structure of the pattern, allowing those who pay attention to understand not only what is happening, but why it was always leading here. The collapse is never just an end. It is the beginning of a new phase shaped by the lessons learned or ignored. And recognizing these mechanisms is the only way to avoid repeating them in whatever comes next. If you stayed with me through this entire journey and these patterns made sense to you in a way they never had before, tell me in the comments with the phrase, "I'm here," until the end, so I know you followed every step of this sequence. And if this content helped you see the larger picture behind what is happening, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next deep dive, and leave a like to help this message reach more people who need to understand it. There's another video right here that expands this discussion and connects directly with what we explored today. Click on it and continue with me while this story unfolds beyond this chapter.